In this video, I'd like to explain how socialization into communities of practice work. So, a community of practice in socialization theory, and this was really pioneered by the anthropologists Lev and Wenger, sees human practice as being made of communities of practice, and that in any community there's going to be more central members. You could think of it as being sort of old timers, and then more peripheral members, newcomers to this. There's people who've been doing the practice a long time, who know all of the unwritten rules of the practice, who can perform in a way which is viewed by all in this community as being expert. Their skills are never questioned. And then there are newcomers who are really still on their journey toward expertise. You can think of this maybe most concretely in sort of the apprentice master model of human organization, where people were apprenticed into skills under the tutelage of a master who gradually taught them what to do. And so, how would one move from a newcomer status, being a peripheral member of the community, a less expert or more expendable member, toward being a more core member of a community? Core meaning that your practices are viewed by all as being expert. Well, there's several different mechanisms through which this process happens. And that process of moving from the periphery to the core, of becoming sort of an old timer, an established figure, is called socialization. And this can happen through observation of what's going on, through interaction with more expert figures. Could be interactions with other newcomers as you make sense of the things that you observe the experts doing. But gradually, then over the course of time, you're trying to move toward a more expert position. And when you're at this sort of edge here, you can have what's called, by Lev and Wenger, legitimate peripheral participation, or LPP. This means that you're a peripheral member, you're not a core member of a given community, but your presence is seen as legitimate. You're not seen as being an interloper, you're not seen as being someone who's mocking the practice by being there or by claiming to be a part of it. So you're allowed to be there, but you're on the journey. And this is a position that many expatriates find themselves in, or newcomers to a culture. And whether people are seen as legitimate or illegitimate peripheral participants is a highly political question. And of course, it's going to depend on the kind of community of practice we're talking about. A community of practice such as ballet classes might have a more porous boundary, more willing to accept legitimate peripheral participants into it than a more closed community of practice. Maybe a community like some kind of a priesthood or a guild, where you may have a high barrier to entry to entering this community of practice. So, what are the means through which we get socialized into these practices? In our cultures of nativity, the cultures that we grew up in, this has sort of been happening to us our entire lives. Like from our infancy, we've become more and more expert at doing the things that the communities around us do. If you think of community of practice as being a family or a neighborhood or some kind of other social community, children observe what's going on, which could be covert or implicit socialization through passive means, just like observation, sort of gathering data, seeing what's happened. You subtly learn what are the appropriate ways of behaving or acting within a given community. There's also more overt or explicit socialization. And this is basically when someone who's a peripheral member does something which is not sanctioned, does something which is considered not a part of this community's practice, something that is seen as non-expert or non-recognizably them. Then there could be more overt forms of socialization in the form of positive or negative evidence. Positive evidence might be sort of rewarding people for what they do, which is correct. By seeing the kinds of things, so someone might see the kinds of practices that are being engaged in, they attempt to mimic those practices and they discover, like, okay, my attempts were successful. I'm accepted. I get the reward. I have accomplished the social aim that I was trying to do. Or there could be negative evidence. Negative evidence could be just simply the lack of observable practice. Like you notice, oh, no one in this community ever does this thing. That means that I'm not going to do it either. There could also be more overt types of negative evidence where you try something and you do it wrong and you receive some kind of punishment. You receive some kind of explicit correction. And the education system is often thought of being a socialization system in which children get socialized into the acceptable and established adult practices of a society. They get models of how one is supposed to behave. They get models of how one is not supposed to behave. They could be overtly rewarded for behaving according to the established practices or overtly punished if they don't conform to those practices. And these are all means by which an individual comes to take on the established set of practices by the more expert, the more powerful, the more core members of a community of practice. And community of practices could be at all different scales. It could be the community of practice could be a group of friends who have established ways of talking, established patterns as they hang out, and a newcomer may have to learn and learn to fit in to the established way. Or we could zoom out all the way to a nation state that, even something as obvious as like a citizenship test, that you would have to prove your expertise at certain kinds of knowledge or certain kinds of practice in order to be accepted as a legitimate member in a society. All of this socialization relates to something which is kind of related, although it's slightly different, which is sociocultural theory. So sociocultural theory is a theory of child development, a theory of education that actually really applies interestingly to these discussions we're having on intercultural communication and intercultural behavior. So Lev Vygotsky was a Soviet child psychologist, and this is a quote from him from his 1978 book. In play, a child always behaves beyond his average age, above his daily behavior. In play, it is as though he were a head taller than himself. So Vygotsky's chief observation was that children are always pretending to be adults. Children are always playing at things which are too hard for them to do, but they either create or are given miniaturized and easier versions of those things and play as if they were doing the more complicated tasks. So his basic hypothesis is that children learn difficult things by playing at easier versions of those things, and that this is how society works. That cognition growth actually depends on tools, tools that kids are using. So let me give an example of this a little bit more concrete. If we think about how we learned to use a shovel expertly, you've probably never stopped to think about how did I learn to use a shovel expertly. But often this kind of tool is much too hard for a child to use. They probably can't pick it up. It's actually sharp. It's kind of dangerous. This is a pretty difficult tool for a child to encounter and to be able to use successfully. So as a step toward that expert tool use, we create a smaller tool, a tool through which they can learn to use another tool. So there's these smaller shovels, which are not as heavy, much smaller, not as dangerous or as sharp. They're not as good as the adult versions at accomplishing the things you might want it to do, but kids play at it, and kids would play maybe at the adult version of this by looking at a childhood tool. And even younger babies who aren't even able to use this kind of plastic shovel might just dig with their hands and use their hands as a step toward that next tool. Or even something like learning to make a sandwich. This is going to differ a little bit more from culture to culture. How do you learn to do it? The child's first attempts at making a sandwich are probably not very successful when they're quite young, but the parents might make the sandwich and then give the child some role in the sandwich making process. And the child would say, I did it, when they're actually not doing all of that much, but they're just attending and being around while the adult is actually expertly making the sandwich, but is beginning to invite the learner to have on specific roles that they're playing within this expert practice. And the child feels like they've accomplished the expert practice And they may eventually then learn to make a kid's version of a sandwich for themselves. It might be messy at first and more simple, and then they would progress over the course of their life to more and more complicated sandwiches. So this idea of tool usage is kind of essential to this idea of socialization and sociocultural learning, social learning. Acquiring the right way to use the right tools for a given culture. Here I have an example of chopsticks. If you've ever eaten with chopsticks or traveled around, you might know that there's different ways to use a chopstick. Whether you're in a Chinese context or Japanese context or Korean context, there's different holds, which are the preferred holds, which are the more expert holds. And if you are in some of these places, people will actually look at the way you're holding chopsticks and overtly try to correct you, overtly try to teach you. So if you're not familiar with using them, you might be seen as a legitimate peripheral participation. No one thinks it's inappropriate for you to be trying to use chopsticks, but you're not expertly using them at first, the first time you do this. And this is true of children within this culture too, that there's often simplified versions of chopsticks that children use where they're connected at first, and then gradually over time they learn to more and more expertly use the chopstick. And in some cultures, there's actually even more specific rules and more specific practices about how these tools are supposed to be used. So here's some examples of Japanese ways of using chopsticks that have different meanings, that have different purposes, and there's different ways of describing this practice. So if you were an outsider, a peripheral participant in the Japanese culture, over time, as you became more expert, the culinary culture, the culinary practices, you might come to be able to distinguish and expertly carry out all of these different motions. So language, in Vygotsky's view, is really the ultimate tool. Just like a shovel or a chopstick, that learning to use a linguistic structure, a linguistic formula, a new word, is like learning the tool of another culture. The same thing that learning chopsticks would perhaps be learning the tool of another culture. So here you could see in this very, very simplified example, you have one person is using English in a way which is maybe considered unusual grammatically from the perspective of the way that English is often taught in many countries. And yet, in many communities of practice, this would sound completely normal. It wouldn't strike people as being unnatural in any way. The person could be seen as a legitimate expert user of the English language. Whereas this other person here on the right-hand side is making no grammatical mistakes. They're using these tools, quote unquote, grammatically correctly, and yet within the perspective of a certain community of practice, this could be judged to be very unnatural. Although, yes, technically you're using some parts of this language correct, you're not using it in a way that expert users of this language within a certain community of practice would use it. You would sound a little unnatural. And you would get kind of feedback. So if you were to give this test maybe to someone who's at the earlier stages of learning the English language and in a country where it's not very widely used, they might judge that the one on the right is actually the more correct form, when actually in some ways the one at the left is the more correct form, that it might be judged within many communities of English users to be the more natural way of using the language, a more non-repetitive way of using the language. So tools could include both the language that we use and even other tools that we create to help us use that language. And we have all of these tools, such as dictionaries and charts and grammar rules, that we create in order to help us learn the tools of another. It's kind of like we create the tool of a user manual in order to help us use the tool of a bulldozer. That you have tools to use a tool, and there's even a tool, the table of contents, which helps us use the tool of the user manual, which helps us use the tool of our car or of a bulldozer. So humans are tool makers, that we create these tools. But to use any tool, you have to be socialized into the practices, socialized into the use. So we create language about language. We call things nouns or verbs. We invent words like conjugation. We have charts. We sing little songs. But really, it takes an expert in a culture in order to learn how to use a tool. And this was sort of Vygotsky's main claim in sociocultural theory, that there was always expert and less expert users of a tool. And that would be true if we conceive of a language as a whole as a tool, but also the sub aspects of a language, how verbs change their form, what's the sentence, or all of these are different tools which accomplish different social ends, and you have to be socialized into the more expert use of it by a more expert person or by another tool that someone has created to replace the more expert person. I think about this, like how should one greet a tough-looking 24-year-old man on the street if they travel to one of these cities, to Kabul or Tegucigalpa or Baalbek in Lebanon in 2021? You might learn from a Spanish book or from a Dari book or from an Arabic book how you're supposed to greet someone. But does that greeting actually work in this particular circumstance for this particular person in this particular city in this particular year in this particular combination? You might find that the language textbook has given you a pretty general tool, but you're not sure if that general tool is actually going to work. There's maybe more useful tools. I can use my arms as a shovel, but humans have invented shovels because it's actually better than arms are at digging. And so what the language learner is faced with, and I think this is true for the culture learner as well, is that you may have a more general term or a more general practice that you think, I think that this would work to get done what I want to do, to warn someone, to greet someone, to compliment someone, to discover information from someone. But there may be, for this particular context, more specific tools that you would need to learn that you didn't ever get in your classes or from a textbook. And you would need to either try the clumsier, more rough tool that you have and get feedback that it didn't work or a better one existed, or overtly ask an expert to help you. What is the right way to act in this situation, to hear their advice, to mimic what they ask you to do, and to practice it with them in order to become more expert. This process can be called other regulation to self-regulation in Vygotsky's theory. Like if we think about this baby going up the stairs, at this age, there's not much that a baby can do to climb the stairs. They're completely dependent on the other to successfully accomplish the task. As the baby gets a little bit older, this baby is able to take steps, but could never keep themselves upright. Here, this woman is helping the baby get up the step by stabilizing the baby a little bit. They're not really doing it on their own. They couldn't do it on their own. But with the help of an expert, the baby is able to climb more on their own. This older child is able to get up on their own without the presence of a human help. So here we have a human doing all the work, here a human doing some of the work. Now there's no human, but this balustrade, the railing, is actually replacing the job that the human would do. So we've created a tool to replace the expert. So I can climb the stairs if I'm this child with the presence of this tool, because this tool is replacing the expert. I don't need the expert anymore. Until eventually I'm old enough that I don't even need the tool. I can just accomplish this task on my own as I've grown in my skill, as I've grown in my expertise. So this is an extended analogy for sociocultural learning as I become more expert at a practice that a society does. So regulation is basically what is in control. Is it the other, and Vygotsky called this vavne, if you know Russian, other regulated. You lean heavily on the other, the expert, to accomplish the task. You can only accomplish the task if the expert is there. Then you move to more object regulation. So here the expert is here, but the training wheels on this bicycle are actually doing some of the work that the expert was doing. And then you eventually move to being self-regulated, vovnutr in Russian, like internally regulated. So you figured out structures that can help you accomplish the task. That might be training wheels at first, and then until you can do the task on your own. So here I do not need the other human being. I do not need the expert anymore. I can carry out this in a way which is recognizably bike riding without anyone else being there. And, is this girl really riding a bike? they might be a little bit more inclined to say what this middle picture is doing, this is a little bit closer to bike riding, but this is actually bike riding. And then, of course, there's a fourth step, which would be to remove the training wheels altogether. And now it is definitely bike riding. It would be judged by all people as this child is riding their bike. So, this zone in which we can learn is what Lev Vygotsky called the zone of proximal development, zona ближайшего развития. That I, the learner, can accomplish this only with your help. I need you to do it for me. I can do it with your help, would be the next stage. I'm still leading the interaction, but I need to rely heavily on you. And if you weren't there at all, I wouldn't be able to do it. Then afterwards, I can create a tool or a little poem or a song or some kind of mnemonic device, a step-by-step checklist, something so that I can do it when you're gone. I can do it on my own using tools which replace you as the expert. And then eventually, I don't need to even rely on that tool anymore. It's so internalized. I know so well what I'm doing that I can do it on my own, and I can do it in a way which is recognized by others as being a legitimate and expert example of this practice that I'm trying to carry out. So we've learned these terms like socialization. Socialization is the process whereby through observing, through getting correction, through figuring out what people never do, through getting scolding or getting punishment, through getting rewards, we come into knowledge of a practice. And sociocultural theory is the theory of Lev Vygotsky, which underlay